When the HOA set out to tear down my family's land for their luxury resort, they had no clue I'd spent months crafting the perfect trap. They swallowed every bit of my bait, hook, line, and sinker. So how did I flip their own greed into the sweetest win our neighborhood ever witnessed? The paper cut from that official HOA notice pricked my finger as I stood by the mailbox. But nothing stung more than the message inside. After a review of community boundaries, your back acre has been reclassified as common property. I read it twice, my hands trembling. That parcel had been in my family for 3 generations. I marched straight to Eleanor Winter's house, the new HOA president, renowned for her immaculate garden and an even more impeccable smile. She opened her door in workout clothes, barely hiding her irritation. "Can I help you, David?" she asked. "This letter says you're taking my land." "There must be some mistake," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. But her smile never reached her eyes. "No mistake," she replied coolly. "Our professional survey shows your grandfather's hand-drawn maps were off. The board voted unanimously last night." "Without telling me?" "I've been paying taxes on that land for 15 years, I protested. She glanced at her manicured nails and said, "Okay, do you, are they, bylaws don't require notification for property corrections. We're planning a splendid resort-style pool there. Everyone will benefit, even you." I was about to argue when booming music exploded from next door. The Morgan's yard. Suddenly, Eleanor's smile softened. "I should go. Tyler and Samantha are hosting the neighborhood welcome party. You should come. It might help you adjust to the changes." On my way home, the music grew louder. Through the fence, I could see neighbors Tyler and Samantha laughing with friends by their brand-new pool built suspiciously near our property line. That night, sleep eluded me as the bass pounded until 1 a.m. I tried calling Tyler twice, but there was no answer. At 1:15, I knocked on their door. Tyler answered, red-faced and clutching a beer. "Hey man, the party's over." "What's going on?" "It's almost 1:30. Some of us have work tomorrow," Samantha added from behind him. We stopped the music right at 1. I pointed out the bylaws, but the noise still lingered. "Look," Tyler interjected, "Eleanor said we're fine until 1. If you can hear us, that's not our problem." I took a deep breath. "Speaking of Eleanor, did you hear about the HOA plan for my back acre?" I asked. Their guilty looks said it all. "You did? You knew they were taking my land?" "Not taking," Samantha corrected. They're relocating. "The resort's going to have a lap pool for serious swimmers, cabanas, and even a cocktail bar on your property," Tyler shrugged. "It's not personal. Eleanor showed us the real property lines. Your grandfather's maps were wrong." Back home, I couldn't sleep. I hauled out Grandpa's old wooden chest from the attic. Inside lay the original property documents, yellowed with age. I spread them out on the kitchen table under a lamp and compared them to the modern survey attached to Eleanor's letter. Something felt off. Grandpa's boundaries were defined by natural landmarks: the creek, the old oak tree, the rocky ridge. Yet the HOA map completely ignored these, drawing straight lines that conveniently sliced off my most cherished acre. In the corner of the deed, I noticed a small note I'd never seen before. It referenced county survey markers from 1952. If those markers still existed, that's when a plan began to form. I knew I'd need help. Scrolling through my contacts, I found James Jacobson, a surveyor who'd worked with my father years ago, and texted him, even though it was 3 a.m. the next morning. I called in sick and drove to the county records office, where my cousin Vince worked. As we dug through dusty files, he muttered, "These HOA folks are getting bolder every year." Then he exclaimed, "Ah, here it is. The 1952 survey clearly shows your property extends farther than you thought. The creek moved after that 70s flood, but the property line stayed the same." My phone buzzed with a community announcement. Groundbreaking for Pinecrest Resort begins Tuesday. Please clear any personal items from the designated area. Tuesday was only 5 days away. On my drive home, I passed the Morgan house where workers were setting up an even bigger speaker system by their pool, and Tyler cheerfully waved as I went by. That afternoon, Jacobson arrived with his equipment. "Let's find those original markers," he said. "If they're still there, the HOA's in big trouble." We worked until sunset, keeping out of sight. Behind my shed, beneath years of overgrown grass, Jacobson's metal detector beeped at the first marker. His eyebrows shot up. "According to this, your property extends another 50 feet that way. This even covers part of the Morgan's new pool." Before dark, we discovered 3 more markers, each confirming what Grandpa's map had shown. My land was larger than I'd been maintaining. "There's more," Jacobson whispered. "See this ridge?" The geological survey from the 50s marks it as a potential archaeological site. Native American artifacts were found here in the 40s. I recalled Grandpa's tales of arrowheads and pottery shards, stories I'd dismissed as mere legend. "What does that mean?" I asked. "Legally, if verified, it could force a historical preservation review that would bar any development." That night, another party kicked off next door. I couldn't help but smile as the music blared. Let them enjoy it while they could. Around 8 p.m., my doorbell rang. It was Rose Thompson, my 80-year-old neighbor from across the street, holding a casserole. "I figured you might need dinner with all the commotion next door," she said. I invited her in and found myself recounting every detail. Rose listened intently before saying, "Eleanor's been pulling these tricks for years. She forced the Hendersons out last summer with bogus violations. Now their house belongs to her daughter. Why does no one stop her? She's even tight with the mayor's wife." Yet there was a twinkle in her eyes. I'd taught high school history for 40 years and volunteered at the county museum, so I knew a thing or two about archaeological preservation. As Rose left, she paused at the door and said, "This land means something to you, doesn't it? More than just its price tag." I thought of Grandpa teaching me to fish in the creek, and my dad building a treehouse in the old oak. This was my history. "Then fight for it," she said, simply. That night as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Meeting tomorrow, 7 a.m. at Eleanor's house. Contractors are coming to mark pool placement on your acre. Don't tell David." My heart pounded. They weren't waiting until Tuesday. I set my alarm for 5 a.m. I had to be ready before they arrived. I woke before sunrise, gulping down coffee as I prepared. Jacobson showed up in an unmarked truck, his equipment hidden under tarps. "If we're right about those markers," he whispered in the dim light, "the HOA survey missed nearly 2 acres of your land." Dew soaked my jeans as we hammered in flags exactly where Grandpa's deed indicated. With every stake, my confidence grew. The final marker landed right in the corner of Tyler and Samantha's fancy new deck. "They built that deck just last month," I told Jacobson. "What a convenient timing." "Not just convenient," he replied while checking his GPS. "County permits show it was built after the HOA's new survey, as if they knew the new boundary ahead of time." He handed me his tablet, displaying the official report. The HOA survey completely ignored the creek's original path before the 1978 flood. No professional would overlook that by accident. As the sun climbed higher, we heard vehicles approaching. "Hide the equipment," I whispered. "Let's see what they do." From behind my garden shed, we watched Eleanor pull up with 3 board members and a landscaping crew. They unloaded spray paint and measuring tools, laughing as they marked spots for cabanas, a tiki bar, and a massive pool, all on my property. "This spa feature will be perfect right here," Eleanor declared, drawing a large X through my grandmother's rose garden that I'd tended for 20 years. I wanted to confront them, but Jacobson held me back. Not yet. We need more. Later that morning, I visited the local historical society where my mom had volunteered. The director, Maria, greeted me warmly. "Your timing is interesting," she remarked, pulling out a folder. "Someone from the county just requested all records about your property." "Eleanor Winters?" she asked, nodding as I explained my situation. Maria's expression darkened. "This happened in Meadowbrook too. Their HOA president works for the same development company as Eleanor." She then produced a newspaper article. They turned half the neighborhood into vacation rentals after forcing out the original owners. Now I understood. This wasn't just about a community pool. It was about property values and underhanded development deals. "I need proof of the archaeological significance Grandpa always talked about," I said. Maria smiled. "Your grandfather even donated some artifacts he found on your land." She brought out a small box containing arrowheads and pottery fragments that had been catalogued but never fully examined. "I can arrange for an expert assessment back home," I said. Later, I found Rose in her garden across the street. "They're marking up your land right now," I told her. "I know," she replied calmly. "I've been taking pictures every hour." She showed me her phone. Documentation was key. That afternoon, I called Vince again. "I need two things: the emergency historical preservation filing process and any details on Eleanor Winters' business connections." While waiting for Vince's call, I noticed Tyler watching me from his yard. "Hey, neighbor," he called out cheerfully, excited about the new resort. I walked over to the fence. "Why did you build your deck after the HOA survey but before the boundary changes were announced?" His smile faltered. "What? The permit for your deck was filed just one day after Eleanor's survey." "Interesting coincidence," I remarked. "Look, we're just following the official property lines," he stuttered. "But the official lines include those 1952 markers I found this morning," I countered. "There's one right under your hot tub," I added. Tyler's face went pale. He mumbled something about needing to make a call and hurried inside. Within minutes, my phone rang. It was Eleanor. "David," her voice purred sweetly, "I hear you have concerns about the community project. Why don't you come over so we can discuss them in person? I'd prefer to have everyone there." "How about a special HOA meeting?" I suggested. "Not necessary. This has already been decided." "Then so is my next move," I replied. "Are you threatening me?" she demanded, her tone hardening. "I'm simply following proper procedures, documenting the original boundary markers that your survey inexplicably missed," I said. "Then what?" she pressed. "Markers. The ones from 1952 that Jacobson found this morning," I stated, nearly hearing her racing thoughts. "Those old markers? They aren't relevant to modern surveys," she argued. "The county assessor's office disagrees," I countered. "I just spoke with them." After a pause, she added, "We'll discuss this tomorrow. In the meantime, stay off the common areas." "You mean my property?" I shot back. "I plan to use every inch of it." "Thanks." I hung up feeling stronger than I had in weeks. Vince called back immediately. "You hit a nerve. Eleanor just requested emergency access to all your property records. It's too late for her, way too late. I've already flagged your parcel with a preliminary historical review notice. Nothing can be developed while that's pending." That evening, I invited Rose and Jacobson over to plan our next steps. We spread maps across my kitchen table when headlights swept past the windows. "Someone's here," Rose whispered from behind the curtains. "It's Eleanor and the Morgans." Before I could reply, my phone buzzed with texts from neighbors. "Are you okay? I saw Eleanor heading to your place with the sheriff. Tyler's saying you threatened him. Jacobson looked grim. They're escalating, trying to intimidate you. Let them try, I said, gathering our evidence into a folder. Soon, the doorbell rang, followed by aggressive knocking. I opened the door to find Eleanor, Tyler, Samantha, and a uniformed man standing there. Good evening, folks, I said calmly. What brings you all here so late? Eleanor stepped forward. David, this is Deputy Wilson. We are concerned about your erratic behavior today. Tyler nodded emphatically. You threatened me in front of my family, he added. I was momentarily speechless. That's completely false, I insisted. Deputy Wilson looked uneasy. Sir, I understand there's a property dispute, but threatening neighbors. I never threatened anyone. In fact, I have witnesses. Just look at Rose's security camera facing my yard. The deputy's expression shifted. Is that so? He murmured. Eleanor interjected. This isn't just about today. We're worried about your mental state, making wild claims about property lines that were supposedly settled years ago. I couldn't help but laugh. Settled? You just resurveyed them last month. Samantha piped up. He's been fixated on boundaries since we moved in, always watching us and complaining about noise, like when you built on my property and partied until 1 a.m., I countered, and the deputy raised his hands. All right, everyone, slow down. This appears to be a civil matter, not criminal. Eleanor wouldn't back down. He's been digging up community land without permission, ruining landscaping. You mean my land? I interrupted. I opened the folder and handed the deputy copies of Jacobson's survey report, the original deed, and photos of the 1952 markers. These documents prove the HOA's survey is wrong. They're trying to seize nearly 2 acres of my legal property. The deputy studied the papers, while Eleanor fumed silently. Ma'am, this seems to be a legitimate property dispute that should be handled through proper channels, not police intervention. He handed the papers back to me. I suggest both parties consult their attorneys. As they turned to leave, I called out, Eleanor, one more thing. You might want to inform your friends at Lakeside Development that the county has just initiated a historical preservation review of my property, effective immediately. Eleanor froze mid-step, then spun around. How did you know about, she began, but caught herself. It was too late. The deputy glanced between us, sensing there was more to this story. Have a good night, I said pleasantly, as I closed the door on her shocked face. Inside, Rose, Jacobson, and I exchanged triumphant looks, though we all knew this was just the beginning. They'll come back with lawyers next, Jacobson warned. Let them come, I replied, tapping the folder. We have the truth on our side. Rose smiled slyly. And tomorrow, we'll have even more. I've arranged for an archaeologist friend to examine those artifacts Maria found. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Vince. I uncovered the connection. Eleanor's husband is the CFO at Lakeside Development, and they've just submitted plans for vacation rentals in our neighborhood. Suddenly, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. This wasn't merely about a fancy resort pool. They were eyeing my land as part of a much larger commercial project. We need to warn the neighbors, I insisted. Already happening, Rose replied, showing me her phone as our neighborhood chat exploded with messages about Eleanor's development ties. Then a final text popped up from an unknown number. HOA emergency meeting, called for 7 a.m. tomorrow. All board members. Code red. Jacobson chuckled. It looked like someone was starting to panic. I should have felt relieved, but instead a nagging unease told me they wouldn't back down easily. Eleanor has too much riding on this. Almost as if on cue, the lights across my backyard blazed on, massive construction floodlights on the Morgans' property aimed directly at my house. The glare was overwhelming, streaming through every window. "What the—" Jacobson began, while Rose squinted through the brightness. "Hey, there's someone by your shed," she noted. Squinting harder, I could just make out figures on my property. Someone was taking down my boundary markers. The low rumble of heavy machinery jolted me awake. At 4:30 a.m., I scrambled to my window and saw a huge yellow bulldozer creeping toward my back acre. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone along with my deed papers and a flashlight and raced outside in my slippers. "Stop right now!" I shouted, waving the flashlight wildly. The bulldozer's headlights blinded me as it barreled forward, its metal blade gleaming in the pre-dawn darkness. The operator, a confused man in a hard hat, finally cut the engine. "Look, buddy, I'm just following orders," he mumbled. He produced some paperwork claiming this is HOA property. "Your paperwork is wrong," I replied, forcing my voice to stay steady despite my pounding heart, while my grandfather's warnings about guarding our property lines echoed in my mind. Soon, headlights swept across my yard as 3 vehicles pulled up. Out stepped Eleanor from her white Range Rover, impeccably dressed in a tailored pantsuit despite the early hour, flanked by the Morgans and 2 unfamiliar men carrying briefcases. "Mr. Jackson, I see you're an early riser too. Wonderful," she called out with a tight smile. "You can watch the groundbreaking ceremony," she added. I raised my phone. "I've already called Sheriff Davis. She's on her way." "You're trespassing on private property," Eleanor retorted, unfolding a document from her leather portfolio. "According to the county survey we commissioned, this land falls within community boundaries, and we're offering a very generous compensation package." Tyler Morgan snickered from behind her. "Time to join the team, Jackson. The resort will boost all our property values." I stood my ground, feeling the damp grass between my toes. I'd filed an emergency injunction just yesterday. This land has been in my family for 3 generations, and I have the original survey markers to prove it. Eleanor's perfectly groomed eyebrows lifted slightly. "An injunction? How inconvenient," she remarked, turning to one of the suited men. "Harold, call Judge Watkins. Wake him if necessary." The distant wail of a police siren cut through the tension. Sheriff Davis, an old fishing buddy of my father's, pulled up in his patrol car, clearly irritated. "What's going on here?" he asked, adjusting his belt as he approached. Eleanor stepped forward with an outstretched hand. "Good morning, Sheriff." "Just a small misunderstanding about property lines. Nothing to worry about," she insisted. "Nothing to worry about?" I countered, my voice rising. "They're trying to steal my land." Sheriff Davis looked between us. "Ma'am, do you have permits for operating this machinery before 7 a.m. and proper construction permits for what you're planning?" Eleanor's smile faltered. "We have HOA authorization." "That's not what I asked," Sheriff Davis interjected. "County ordinance forbids construction before 7 a.m. in residential areas, and I don't see any permits posted." While they argued, I noticed Rose, my 78-year-old neighbor who had served on the original HOA board 30 years ago, walking toward us with a stack of yellowed papers. "Eleanor!" Rose called out in a surprisingly strong voice despite her frail frame. "You might want to review these before you make a terrible mistake." Eleanor dismissed her with a wave. "Not now, Rose." Unperturbed, Rose handed me the papers. "Your grandfather and I prepared for this scenario years ago. The HOA pulled this same stunt back in '89 with the Henderson property." I skimmed the documents. Original meeting minutes showing the true boundaries had been officially recorded with the state, not just with the county sheriff. "I'm going to file harassment charges, and I demand that you remove these people and their equipment from my property immediately." Eleanor's phone buzzed, and she stepped away to answer it, her face darkening as she listened. When she returned, her voice was subdued. "There appears to be a paperwork conflict," she announced to her group. "We'll postpone today's work to sort out these technicalities." The bulldozer operator looked relieved as he climbed down from his machine. "So no work today. Pack it up," Eleanor snapped. As they reluctantly retreated, I saw several neighbors gathering at the edge of my property, recording everything on their phones. Noticing this, Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she strode to her car. "This isn't over, Jackson. The board votes tomorrow on invoking our emergency powers clause. I suggest you prepare a reasonable counteroffer before then." After they drove away, Sheriff Davis turned to me. "Your dad always said the HOA would try something like this after he passed. You holding up okay?" I nodded, suddenly feeling the heavy burden of fighting this battle alone. "I'll be fine, but I need to gear up for tomorrow." Rose patted my arm gently. "You're not alone, dear. Some of us remember how this community started before people like Eleanor turned it into their private country club." As we stood in my yard watching the sunrise, my phone dinged with a text. "Found something big in the county archives. Meet me at 9. Bring coffee, lots of it." I looked up at neighbors still lingering at the edge of my property, some giving encouraging waves, others awkwardly turning away. The battle lines were being drawn, and tomorrow's vote would reveal exactly who stood where. Later, as I pushed through the double doors of the Maple Ridge Community Center, Eleanor's assistant tried to block my path. The emergency HOA meeting had begun 20 minutes early, another of Eleanor's tricks. "Actually, I can," I replied, clutching my leather briefcase containing the results of my all-night research with Jacobson. Documents that could change everything. Heads turned as I marched down the center aisle. The room was packed with over 100 neighbors, some I'd known for decades, and others new, lured by Eleanor's promises of a resort-style community upgrade. At the podium, Eleanor stood mid-sentence, her crimson lipstick matching her blazer. As I was saying before the interruption, the vote to invoke our Community Enhancement Clause requires a 2/3 majority. But before anyone votes, you need to know exactly what you're voting on. Eleanor's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around the microphone. "Mr. Jackson, you're out of order. We're following Robert's rules here," she snapped. "Funny you mention rules," I retorted as I opened my briefcase. "I've spent the night uncovering just how many you've broken." Whispers rippled through the crowd. I spotted the Morgans in the front row, with Tyler nervously tugging at his collar 3 rows back. Rose nodded at me encouragingly. "Point of order," Harold, Eleanor's lawyer friend, called. "The agenda doesn't allow for changes without proper notice. Section 5 of your bylaws mandates a 72-hour notice for emergency meetings, with no changes permitted after distribution," I countered. Harold fell silent as several neighbors murmured in agreement. I then approached the front table where the board sat. "I request 10 minutes to present relevant information before any vote occurs." Board member Diana Chun, known for her fairness, despite her close ties with Eleanor, spoke up. "I motion that we allow Mr. Jackson to speak," and several voices seconded. Eleanor's face tightened, but she stepped aside. "Very well, 10 minutes. I laid out 3 large maps on the presentation table. This first document is the original 1952 survey of Maple Ridge, showing the natural creek boundary that defined my family's property. I pointed to the winding blue line. That creek once formed the natural border between private and community land, but it shifted during the flood of 78. "Ancient history," Eleanor interrupted. "Our recent survey, no, your survey, conveniently ignores the original boundary markers, which state law upholds as the legal definition even when natural features change," I continued, unveiling Jacobson's new certified survey, with red boundary lines extending far beyond the HOA's claim. According to state law and county records, my property includes all this area, which, unfortunately for some of you, means you've been assuming land isn't yours. Gasps filled the room as neighbors absorbed the implications. That's impossible! Tyler Morgan sputtered, his face paling. Unfortunately not, I replied. Your swimming pool extends 12 feet onto my legal property, and Eleanor's home addition from last spring goes 18 feet over the line. All eyes turned to Eleanor, whose composed facade finally began to crack. This is absurd. Our survey was done by your brother-in-law's company, she insisted. Exactly. A clear conflict of interest, as I've outlined in an ethics complaint filed with the state licensing board this morning, I shot back, handing copies to each board member. But there's something even more significant. I carefully removed a plastic bag from my briefcase containing what appeared to be stone arrowheads. During our legitimate survey yesterday, we discovered these artifacts, which the county archaeologist has tentatively dated to around 800 years ago. The room fell utterly silent. I've already filed for historical preservation status, I explained. That means no construction can take place within 200 feet of the discovery site, effectively covering my entire property. Rose rose from her seat and slowly made her way to the front. I was there when these items were first uncovered. As an amateur archaeologist, I instantly recognized their importance. Eleanor's lawyer leaned in urgently to whisper something to her, but she brusquely shoved him aside. This is just a stalling tactic, she hissed. We've got investors on standby. Contracts are already signed. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Diana Chen leaned forward. Investors? Eleanor, the board hasn't approved any contracts yet. The error registered on Eleanor's face, but it was too late. The room erupted in a flurry of questions. Order! Order! Eleanor shouted, slamming her gavel so hard that it nearly broke. I wasn't finished. While poring over property records, I uncovered something else noteworthy. I held up a document with several highlighted sections. 3 months ago, you and your husband formed an LLC called Ridgeline Development Partners. 2 weeks later, that LLC purchased the vacant lot next to my property, a lot that would skyrocket in value if a resort were built next door. Board member Frank Thompson's eyes widened in disbelief. You claimed you sold that lot to your cousin, Eleanor snarled. This is nothing but character assassination. I replied calmly, it's all public record. At that moment, Diana Chen stood up. I move that we adjourn this meeting and suspend all actions regarding the proposed development until a full investigation into these allegations is completed. Several voices seconded the motion. You can't do this. Eleanor's voice rose dangerously. We have deadline, she argued. What deadlines? Frank asked. And what contracts are you referring to? As the board members began bickering, I noticed Tyler Morgan slipping out a side door with his phone pressed to his ear. Eleanor caught me watching him leave, and something cold flashed in her eyes. This isn't over, Jackson. Not by a long shot. As the meeting descended into chaos, Diana approached me. You should know, Eleanor's been talking to city officials about rezoning this entire area. Whatever game she's playing, it's bigger than just your property. I nodded, suddenly understanding why she'd been so aggressive. Thanks for the warning. While neighbors crowded around me with questions, my phone vibrated with a text from Jacobson. Don't celebrate yet. I found building permits filed under a different company name. They're targeting Rose's property next. Meet me at the county office ASAP. Lee, I glanced across the room at Eleanor, huddled with Harold and 2 board members. Despite the setback, she managed a slight smile. Whatever her plan, I realized this battle was far from over. Get off my property, I shouted, as Eleanor's sleek car pulled into my driveway, kicking up gravel. The entire HOA board spilled out like angry hornets from a disturbed nest. My heart pounded, but I planted my feet firmly on my porch steps. "We need to talk," Eleanor said, her voice icier than winter. Clutching a leather folder so tightly her knuckles turned white, she declared, "Your little stunt at the meeting has forced us to involve our attorneys." Behind her, a nervous man in an expensive suit kept glancing at his watch. "Mr. Peterson, HOA Legal Counsel," he mumbled, barely glancing my way. I crossed my arms. "Funny," I replied. "I was just about to call my lawyer and the county assessor, maybe even the local news station." Eleanor's face twitched, and the other board members exchanged worried glances. "Perhaps we can discuss this inside," suggested Peterson, his voice cracking slightly. I shook my head. "We can settle this right here where everyone can see. I'm done with secret meetings and backroom deals." Mrs. Garcia from next door was busy watering her flowers, clearly eavesdropping, while Rose had positioned her lawn chair on her porch so she could see into my yard. Even old Mr. Jenkins had his window open, his hearing aid turned up high. Peterson cleared his throat. "We've reviewed your documentation," he said. "The board is prepared to make a reasonable offer." I raised an eyebrow. "And that is?" "We'll drop all claims to your property," Eleanor said through clenched teeth, "in exchange for you waiving any claims against the structures currently on your land." I laughed. "You mean your illegal home addition and the Morgan's pool that extends 8 feet onto my property? That's your big offer?" Board member Keith insisted, his face reddening. "It's more than fair." "And what about the bulldozer that nearly destroyed my garden? The noise violations? The threats? The lies you fed the community about my property?" Peterson stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Be reasonable." "We could be locked in court for years," I replied, pulling out my phone. "But I recorded Eleanor giving orders to start construction before the approved date. And I have statements from 3 contractors who were told to ignore property markers." Eleanor lunged forward. "You can't prove any of that. And I have copies of emails where you discussed pressuring me into selling," I continued, watching her face pale. "My cousin in county records found those quite damning. Did you know that improperly filed HOA documents become public record after 7 years? The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Peterson leaned in urgently, whispering to Eleanor, whose perfectly styled hair seemed to droop with every second. "What do you want?" she finally asked, defeat creeping into her tone. "I've been waiting for that question. First, I demand a binding agreement with strict penalties if broken. The leisure centre must be built on the actual common land by the front entrance. Second, the noise rules must be revised and strictly enforced. Third, you issue a public apology at the next meeting." Tyler, who had been hovering behind, pushed forward. "That's ridiculous. You can't make demands like—" Eleanor began. "I'm not finished," I interrupted calmly. "Fourth, I want a seat on the Architectural Review Committee. And finally, a fund must be established for property line verification for every home in the neighborhood, funded by the HOA reserves." "Impossible!" Eleanor exploded. We'd have to raise dues." "Or cut your executive compensation," I suggested with a smile. "Your choice." The group huddled together, whispering frantically. Peterson shook his head repeatedly as Eleanor jabbed her finger at my house. Mrs. Garcia abandoned her gardening duties and watched openly, and Rose gave me an encouraging thumbs up from her porch. After what felt like an eternity, Eleanor marched back, her designer heels sinking into my lawn. "Fine," she spat, extending her hand, "but this agreement includes a non-disclosure clause." "No one's going to hear about what happens here," I replied firmly, shaking her cold hand. "It's too late for secrecy. The neighbors already know everything." As they filed back to their cars, defeated and muttering, I overheard board member Keith whisper, "Why did we agree to all this?" Eleanor hissed back, because he didn't mention the tax reassessment that would occur if the correct property lines were reported to the county. We'd all be ruined. I smiled inwardly. I hadn't even considered that angle. Sometimes the best victories come from letting your enemies imagine their worst fears. The battle was won, but I knew the war was far from over. Eleanor's eyes held a promise of revenge as she drove away. What would she do next? My hands trembled as I unfolded the certified letter. 6 months after our showdown, Eleanor had vanished from public view. Yet rumors swirled through the neighborhood like autumn leaves. Some said she was gathering evidence against me, while others claimed she'd hired private investigators. The whispers kept me up at night. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for that evening. Would she make her move then? I scanned the official letterhead and gasped. The county tax assessor had completed their review of all Pinecrest Village properties. Based on the new surveys, Eleanor's property value had surged by 40% due to undisclosed improvements encroaching on my land, with similar increases for the Morgans. My own taxes remained unchanged, thanks to the historical designation Jacobson had helped secure. Then the doorbell rang, startling me. Through the peephole, I saw Tyler Morgan standing alone, shifting nervously. "What do you want?" I asked, opening the door just a crack. "Can we talk?" he said. He looked different, humbler somehow. "I brought something you need to see," he said quietly, placing a USB drive on my coffee table. "Eleanor's been planning something huge," he explained in a low tone. "After you forced her to apologize, she became obsessed with getting even. She even convinced half the board to support her secret project." I picked up the drive. "What's this?" "Everything. Emails, plans, fabricated evidence meant to discredit my property claims." He looked ashamed. "Samantha and I were in on it until we saw just how far she'd go." "Why turn on her now?" I asked, suspiciously. Tyler sighed. "The tax reassessment hit us hard. When I asked Eleanor for help, she just laughed and said we were acceptable collateral damage in her war against you. We've got kids heading to college. We can't afford her revenge games." His eyes met mine. That evening, the HOA meeting room buzzed with tension. Attendance was higher than usual, and word had spread that something major was about to unfold. I spotted the Morgans seated away from Eleanor, who glared at them with venom, while Rose pounded her gavel, now acting as interim president. Before any regular business could begin, someone announced, "Mrs. Winters has an announcement." Eleanor strode to the podium, triumph glittering in her eyes. "After months of investigation, I've uncovered evidence that will shock this community," she declared, pulling out a folder. "The property survey that caused all this trouble was based on fraudulent documentation." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as my heart raced. "I move that we immediately reverse all decisions based on these false claims and pursue legal action against—" "Point of order!" I shouted, standing before any vote. "The board should review this evidence that just came to light today." I connected Tyler's USB drive to the projector. Eleanor's face drained of color as her own emails appeared on screen, exposing her scheme to fabricate evidence against me. That's not real, she stammered. "It came from your own computer, Eleanor," Tyler said, standing beside his wife. "We have sworn statements detailing how you asked us to help create fake documents." The room erupted as board members shouted questions and homeowners demanded answers. Amid the chaos, I noticed Peterson, the HOA attorney, quietly slipping out the back door. Rose pounded her gavel repeatedly. "Order! As acting president, I move that we immediately suspend Mrs. Winters from the board, pending a full investigation." The vote was unanimous, except for Eleanor, who sat frozen as people filed out. Afterwards, neighbors who once avoided me stopped to chat. Mrs. Garcia brought homemade cookies, and old Mr. Jenkins clapped me on the shoulder. You stood up for all of us, he grumbled. These fancy newcomers forget what community really means. 2 weeks later, a construction crew broke ground on the new leisure center on the proper community land near the entrance, exactly as I had suggested. The updated noise ordinances transformed our once rowdy neighborhood into a peaceful haven, and Eleanor quietly listed her house for sale. Later, a knock at my door revealed Rose holding a bottle of champagne and some official-looking papers. The board voted unanimously, she announced proudly, and you're now chairman of both the Architectural Review Committee and the newly formed Property Rights Committee. We sat on my porch watching the sunset, glasses raised. I never wanted a fight, I admitted. I just wanted what was rightfully mine. Rose nodded. Sometimes the best trap isn't set with anger but with patience. You gave Eleanor enough rope, and she ended up hanging herself. As twilight settled over my land that will remain in my family for generations thanks to its new protected status, my phone buzzed with a message from university experts. Finished testing those artifacts Jacobson found. They're not just real, they're rare. I laughed out loud. Grandfather always said this land was special, but even he couldn't have guessed how valuable it would become. Not in dollars, but in community. The HOA fell perfectly into my trap, scrambling to seize what they thought was an easy prize, never suspecting I'd set a snare that would safeguard this place forever. The sweetest victories aren't won by brute force, but by wisdom. And sometimes justice comes wrapped in preservation orders that not even the most determined HOA can override.